There's a real distinction between followers and leaders. Often, ideological leaders are actually not cognitively rigid at all. They're actually very cognitively flexible. They're opportunistic. They're happy to change according to, the moods of followers, and they're happy to exploit that. But what they're trying to exploit is the cognitive rigidity of followers, of citizens, to kind of take them on with their mission.
I'm Jon Favreau.
I'm Max Fisher.
And you just heard from today's guest, political psychologist and neuroscientist, Dr. Leor Zmigrod. Dr. Zmigrod recently published a new book, The Ideological Brain, that explores how our biology is correlated to our ideological tendencies, which has all kinds of implications for what really informs our political beliefs and what makes us susceptible to more rigid, extreme ideologies. It's fascinating stuff, so I invited her on to talk about the book and what her research can teach us about opening our minds and changing our beliefs. It's a great conversation. We'll get to it in a minute.
Such a golden age of using hard sciences to understand things like politics and political behavior that I think we always thought were outside the bounds of hard science. And it's really exciting, I think.
And I said this to her, but like I come at this from politics, but also like sociological background. So I'm always looking for nature and what life experiences are shaping your politics and your ideologies. And it was fascinating to hear from a neuroscientist about like what is in our brains and what is determining what we think.
The human animal.
Yeah, exactly. But before we get to all that, welcome back, Max.
Thank you.
How was vacation?
It was great, man. I was in Japan. It was my third trip. I love that place. It's one of the best.
Did they love our tariffs?
Everybody was very polite to me about not bringing up the fact that our dumbass bullshit country was trying to destroy their economy and ours for no reason whatsoever. Yeah, which I thought was really nice.
I wouldn't have been so
nice.
No,
I kept thinking like, don't you want to like tell me off for my horrible country? There was a moment when
we're the big assholes here in America.
I mean, in fairness, that has always been kind of our thing, but it's especially our thing
like
these
us and
days.
The French.
Yeah, that's right. No, we love the French.
Sorry. So don't come at me, French listeners.
I had this funny moment when I was like reading about the tariffs on my phone and about how all tech products are about to get so much more expensive. And then I looked up and realized I was in the middle of a Tokyo shopping district surrounded by said tech products. And I was like, should I just throw out all of my dirty laundry and fill my bag with Nintendo Switches?
I mean, might have been a good idea.
It would have been a good idea, yeah. I decided not to take on the arbitrage opportunity of a lifetime, which is why you're hearing about it on the show. If I'd done it, I definitely would not have mentioned it.
You would
here.
not have talked about that.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to have you back.
Oh, thanks,
we missed you. All right, so we've got some big news to cover today before we get to the interview, so let's get into it. Free speech warrior Mark Zuckerberg took the witness stand this week.
No gold chain at that appearance.
No gold chain. He took the stand this week to defend Meta in a big antitrust case that, if successful, could break up the social media giant. Federal Trade Commission alleges that Meta's acquisition of Instagram in 2012 and their acquisition of WhatsApp in 2014 were part of a, quote, buy or bury strategy to eliminate competition and illegally monopolize the social media market. As evidence, the FTC presented to the court a series of emails and internal communication between Zuckerberg and Facebook leadership, detailing the company's aggressive acquisition strategy, including a 2012 email where Zuckerberg specifically discussed the importance of, quote, neutralizing a competitor when discussing Instagram.
Subject line, antitrust violation.
You're going to want to put this in the antitrust folder.
That's true.
That's how you're going to want it after I'm done with it.
should have filed that one,
Zuckerberg and Meta's lawyers, to the surprise of no one, have denied the FTC's allegations and have argued that Facebook is not an illegal monopoly because it experiences competition from TikTok, LinkedIn, YouTube, other
just
platforms.
A little guy.
Just
it's a
little
small
guy.
bean.
Yeah, it was just a mom and pop business.
That's right.
I feel like we've talked about this trial before for a long time. Now that it's finally underway, what has surprised you the most?
There was this one Zuckerberg email from 2018 that absolutely blew my mind. He wrote, quote, as calls to break up the big tech companies grow, there is a non-trivial chance that we will be forced to spin out Instagram. And then he went on, while most companies...
can predict the future.
I know. Who could have foreseen? He wrote, while most companies resist breakups, the corporate history is that most companies actually perform better after they've been split up. The synergies
I
are
didn't hear
usually,
that part
oh
of
my,
the
it's
quote.
nuts. The synergies are usually less than people think, and the strategy tax is usually greater than people think. We may later regret not course correcting sooner in a way that may remain masked if the family of apps stays together. So what he was basically saying was not only like, by the way, the FTC is right and should break us up, but decided to undermine any potential defense for Meta, saying that this would unfriendly harm their business by saying it would not actually be that harmful for their business, and they expect it to happen anyway.
Yeah, seems a little damning. Though, what do you think about all the evidence so far? Because it does seem like the government, the FTC, has an uphill climb just based on the standard of what they have to prove. And there's a couple complicating factors here. One, they basically have to prove a counterfactual, which is like what the world would have been like had Facebook not gobbled up Instagram and WhatsApp. The other thing is, the mergers, both mergers were approved. And so there is the risk that they're saying, okay, is a deal ever final? And you approved it once, and now all these years later, you're saying no. And then what Facebook is arguing, what Meta's arguing, with some validity is, TikTok is a pretty big competitor that popped up after they scooped up Instagram, and Instagram and TikTok compete pretty well. In fact, TikTok's doing better.
Yeah. This has been something that's been really interesting to follow in the trial, is how the FTC has tackled that defense specifically, because Meta has kind of argued that it's like, we're not a social networking, or Facebook is not a social networking app primarily. It's an entertainment app, much like TikTok or Reddit, and therefore they exist in a larger universe of competition such that buying off Instagram and WhatsApp don't foreclose the competitiveness of the market. And the FTC, I think, has done a really good job of not just showing that Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp are in this really separate kind of market of person-to-person connection, but that the people making the decision to buy these companies at now Meta, then Facebook, know that specifically, and that they considered this to be part of cornering what they consider to be their primary market of social
networks.
Social networking. And there's all these emails about Instagram has to say it has to remain a social networking app rather than a public facing like influencer app. And then the other aspect of it, as you mentioned, is that they have to prove that this was deliberately an effort to remove the competitiveness of the market. And there are a ton of emails.
Well, that seems like most evidence is.
Yeah, they've got that absolutely dead to rights, because there's all these emails where Zuckerberg talks about Instagram cannibalizing Facebook's business, which is further proof that they consider that business to be connecting people who know each other with one another, rather than just showing you videos that are entertaining.
What do you think the world looks like if Meta is forced to sell off Instagram and WhatsApp? What is social media? What changes about social media?
It's really wild to think about that. I have been thinking about it a lot, and I have some guesses, but I don't feel extremely strongly about any of them. So I'd be curious what you think. I mean, I think the two big buckets are what would it mean for Instagram and what would it mean for Meta? I think WhatsApp would pretty much remain just WhatsApp, just what it is.
Seems like it.
Yeah. I think Instagram is really thriving right now and will probably continue to do well. Its numbers have been up. It's doing well among young people. It would suffer without access to Meta headquarters. One, they're heavy hitter programmers who are constantly evolving the algorithm specifically, which is such a big part of their business, and access to Meta's very voluminous user data, where they're constantly tracking us in our lives, what we do on the internet, and they use that to sell the hyper-targeted ads that are, of course, the corner of their business. Without access to those two things, there is a possibility, I think, that Instagram would start to kind of slowly lose the algorithmic arms race to TikTok. I think they'd still be successful, but I think it would start to be distinguished a little bit less. But what do you think Instagram would look like in a kind of post-Meta world?
I guess this is a more hopeful wish.
Yeah.
But Instagram over the years, since being bought by Meta, looks more like Facebook in ways where it's you're seeing more of the ads. Now, this is just probably social media companies in general, maybe, but more of the ads, more of the, when you're done with your feed now, you just get a bunch of shit from people you don't follow.
Yep.
So it's just a lot more crap on
Garbage.
Instagram.
Yeah.
Like what was wonderful about Instagram when
Right.
it started was like, this is your place
Right.
for your social circle,
Mhm.
right? And your network and who you choose. And now it's just so much bigger than that.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it would like slide back into that. Just
I would love that.
because does it really want to compete?
Yeah.
Like, is it the best business choice for it to try to compete with TikTok?
That's true. And with Facebook.
And with
Because it would
Facebook?
actually have to compete with Facebook because, of course, the premise of the whole case is that they're not currently competing.
Right. And so I wonder what the user experience would be like and how that
Mhm.
might change.
I do
Because I think
think,
there's a market for
of
a user
course.
experience that is much better than TikTok. That were different than TikTok,
Mhm.
better than Facebook.
I feel like I am constantly talking to people who used to use Instagram and stopped using it because it's become, like you said, this just like public facing influencer thing where you can't actually share photos with people the way you used to. And because they feel not great about supporting this company that has done so many terrible things.
Yeah, there's that also.
I think that the question that I'm most curious about is what it would mean for Meta HQ, because they really have no other prospects. Other
Right.
Instagram and WhatsApp is kind of their business at this point. Like their metaverse pitch completely failed. I know. Remember that?
Remember the
The
metaverse?
metaverse. They finished the legs, but that's as far as they got. Their VR project failed. Their AI is like they're pumping a ton of money into it, and it's not keeping up with the other AI models. They tried to launch Messenger as its own thing. That didn't take off, even though again they bought WhatsApp so
WhatsApp.
they could compete it out. They are still making cajillions of dollars in their less publicly visible and like less discussed but more important business, which is just tracking us across all of our internet activity and then selling that to advertisers. That's like where they make actually a lot of their bread. And they're still gonna, like, anytime you open a website, there's a Facebook tracker, and they're still gonna have that, and they're still gonna be able to sell that to advertisers. Although
And they still have Facebook, which is still,
that's true.
I mean, it's not like growing as fast as it would, but it's still probably
It's
like
still
the
a huge platform.
still
yeah.
a huge platform.
Yeah. But you do
But I think they would be they're just not just physically smaller because
Right.
they've sold off these, but like I
Right.
just think it would be a different.
Right.
I mean, Mark, wants world domination,
Mhm.
but I don't think that would necessarily be in the cards for the reasons you just cited.
And you wonder about what the world and the internet look like when Mark Zuckerberg no longer has the power to pull a lever and say, we're making an algorithmic change, and it ricochets across both of these huge platforms.
Yes.
Now he just has control over Facebook. And if he decides he wants to make Facebook a pro MAGA, all fake news, all conspiracy theory platform, as he has, that's just on Facebook now. And Instagram can choose to go the same way, can choose to go a different way to differentiate itself. And his political power, I think, really declines as a result.
Well, the other big question is who buys WhatsApp
Right.
and
Right.
especially Instagram.
Yeah.
Because you're right, WhatsApp is it's a messenger,
It is
right?
its
Like
own thing,
it has
yeah.
been probably changed
Mhm.
the least
Yeah.
of anything that Meta's gobbled up.
Right.
Um,
And it's doing quite well on its own, so it kind of doesn't need to
Right.
evolve.
but Instagram,
Mm-hmm.
Trump's president, Trump's FTC,
Yeah.
one of those goons
Right.
could scoop up Instagram, and then that could be a MAGA platform.
I mean, we know that there are buyers out there from all of the potential TikTok buyers
Exactly.
who surfaced, and like not all of them are scary. Like
Mhm.
if Oracle or whatever, like sports gambling guy wants to come forward
Yeah.
and buy it. Although a lot would actually.
Larry Ellison,
I listen. No one who wants to buy Instagram is probably going to be like our best friend.
our best friend.
But yeah,
that is true. That's unfortunate. It is notable that Trump's FTC didn't try to kill this case.
yes,
Especially after Mark's MAGA
Mhm.
makeover, which included, $1 million inaugural donations,
Right.
legal settlements,
Yep.
dressing like he's waiting for a Trump invite to the UFC fight. Uh,
and he's still waiting.
He's still waiting, not getting the invite. Much of MAGA world has been talking about Zuck's, quote, costume,
Yep.
which Josh Hawley said during last week's hearing, a line he got from our friend Sarah Wynne Williams,
Mhm.
the Facebook whistleblower.
Mhm.
Do you think he's been officially cast out of MAGA world? Was there ever a chance for him?
It really seems like it because he really, like, everything that he has done over the last 7 years of sucking up to Donald Trump, like hiring a MAGA guy to put at the top of the executive team, skewing the algorithms to favor MAGA content, rewriting the rules personally for Trump, doing his personal MAGA rebrand, like you said, just like forking over a $25 million donation to Trump, which is like, it's just a bribe, let's be honest.
Yeah.
All of that was for this moment about a month ago when he went to the White House. He actually went 3 times to ask Trump, please kill this FTC case. And he didn't do it. And he even, I thought I knew the depths to which Zuckerberg was bending himself to try to like bend the knee to Trump. But there was this Wall Street Journal story that just came out that detailed it going even further. He called the FTC. He called the FTC head directly, just rang him up. And he offered him a $450 million settlement. The FTC was asking for $30 billion first, and then they scaled that back to $18 billion or plus a dissent decree that would put some rules on Meta. And Zuckerberg offered them $450 million. And I think like reading between the lines, he was kind of trying to tell the FTC, like, I'm Trump's buddy now, so you better take what you can get. But
Meta said it was a reflection of his view of how weak the case is that he was going.
Of course. That's right. Everybody believes it. That's why he upped his bid to $1 billion. But
Yeah, right.
why do you think Trump ultimately didn't come to his rescue? Because I thought there was a real chance he might.
I unfortunately think it is a stupid reason,
With
like
Trump?
everything that happens in that universe,
Sure.
which is that a bunch of the MAGA diehards
Mhm.
just still hate Zuckerberg. And the reason they hate Zuckerberg is because they
Oh.
think he rigged the 2020 election
Yes.
with the Zuckerbucks.
Right.
And I don't even, it's hard to keep track of the conspiracy
I
there,
know.
but it's
Yeah.
like they pumped some money into some nonpartisan,
Mhm.
voting stuff, encouraging people to vote,
Right.
but more of it ended up in the more populous places because
Right.
that's where the people are.
Right.
That's the blue states. And so they think it was
Right.
I
I think my read on what kind of is behind that conspiracy, because of course it's complete bullshit, but it does seem like in the kind of final weeks of the election, Facebook and the other big social media companies went from like fully putting their feet on the gas for Trump to like pulling back a little bit. Like, remember, he got his account banned, he got some posts taken down, and I think they all thought that he was going to lose, which of course he did. And they kind of thought like, it's finally over and we don't want to like fully put both thumbs on the scale for him. And I think to Trump world, anything less than total capitulation
yes.
looks like you're conspiring against us.
And I think there's also a view in Trump world that, that some of them have expressed very publicly
Mhm.
that like Elon was at least there early
Yeah,
on,
right.
even if they don't like Steve Bannon's not
Right.
obviously on board with Elon, but
Right.
I've heard him say, he's like, well, at least he was there for a while.
Right.
And he's like, some of these guys like Zuckerberg, they just jumped in at the as soon as they called Pennsylvania.
I mean, it is true.
Which
that
is not-
right. It was clearly all calculated from Zuckerberg and is not actual genuine commitment.
Mike Davis, who's that right-wing asshole lawyer, the
Mhm.
Article 3 project,
Yeah,
who's done a
yeah,
lot of
yeah.
Project 2025 bullshit. Semaphore talked to him, and he said Mark Zuckerberg rigged and stole the 2020 election, and that's why President Trump got chased out of the White House, why he faced 4 years of unprecedented lawfare. And then he said, I just can't believe that President Trump would let Mark Zuckerberg go into the Oval Office and take down his pants.
Wow. Whose pants are getting taken off in that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think you could go a lot of different ways.
I
with
hate
that.
either. Yeah.
But he was just mad that Zuckerberg was ever allowed into the Oval Office in the
Wow.
first place. So the hate runs deep there.
So okay.
So it seems personal, petty.
It does.
Lack of loyalty
It does.
to dear leader.
Mhm.
Like I said, all stupid.
I think that there is a larger lesson here because it's not just Zuckerberg who is
Right.
getting burned by Trump. It is all of Silicon Valley is getting burned right now. Like most of the
Hate
industry.
to see it.
I know. Gosh.
You know what I've been saying, if there's Trump voters out there and they're like, this is not what I voted for. I didn't
Right.
think he would do this. And everyone
Right.
does the like leper. I didn't think the leper would eat my
yeah,
face.
yeah.
I don't like it because I'm
Right.
like, I'm just trying to build a coalition, bring
Mhm.
people in,
Of
win.
course.
That's it.
Of course.
Not because I think they're
Right.
I'm not going to pass judgment on anyone.
Mhm.
But the tech people,
They knew better.
fuck you.
Yep.
Sorry.
100%.
Sorry.
Yes.
Hope you enjoy everything you get.
Well, they're getting fucking creamed. Like, as bad as this is for Zuckerberg, like this has been, Trump's second term has been a disaster for all of big tech. Like the tariffs have just broken the business model for the existing companies. It doesn't work anymore. The risk of a recession plus high rates absolutely kill the startup economy. China banned rare earths, which means no more semiconductor manufacturing in the U.S. Like
Immigration.
That's right, immigration.
Because remember
high-skilled
they
immigration
all
is a disaster
fucking
for them.
believed Trump when he was like, yeah, let's staple
We're
a
gonna
green card
keep-
onto a diploma. Yeah. Are we
I
there? Is that
know.
what we're doing now?
Yeah.
We're stapling green cards on diplomas, or are we like taking away green cards based on fucking writing op-eds,
Right.
rounding up legal residents and sending them out of the country?
Yes. I mean, I think that Silicon Valley, they thought they could have it both ways with this guy. They thought they could keep everything that they liked about Biden, that
Right,
they
which
could
is-
keep the booming economy, they could keep the manufacturing coming back while getting rid of what they didn't like, which
Which
was
is pronouns in bio.
I actually think they never minded that. I think it was just like
Elon.
it was being regulated, and it was stuff like the chip export ban. And it was, everything about the FTC, like given like Mark Andreessen is like
Crypto. They're
more
mad
or
about
less,
they're mad about crypto.
right? The
They
crypto
don't want crypto
regulation.
being regulated.
I mean, all these FTC cases are huge and are like potentially, like we were just talking about, like pretty. There's another one coming next week for Google. Like
there is like
potentially,
they're annoyed about. I mean, I was like joking with the pronoun thing, not really, but like that
Mhm.
is that was sort of a stand-in for
Mhm.
woke stuff,
Sure.
DEI.
Yeah,
They were really mad about like
Right.
that was all stuff that they were, because when you're that rich and you have nothing else to do, you sit around and bitch about the culture, I guess.
I think it's Silicon Valley following in a mistake that big business and industry has made, not just in this country, throughout history with rising authoritarian movements, which is that they think that they can kind of like get on the inside of it. They think that they can cut deals with the dictators to get favorable treatment, and they can exist outside the law, which is ultimately, I think, what they wanted. They wanted to exist outside of the law. They can like make authoritarianism work for them, be in the inside circle, and it never ever works. It always backfires. And the reason it never works is whatever short-term deal you might cut, like even if Trump had come through for Zuckerberg on this FTC deal, like in order for business to flourish, you need genuine rule of law, and you need functioning markets. And dictators always destroy both of those because they're primarily motivated by cronyism, corruption, and suppressing dissent. And that never, even if you get like a short term, it's the oldest fucking story. It's every dictator that rises, like so many businesses are like, oh, this is going to be our guy, and they get burned.
I think what's different and even worse about this is that this particular authoritarian is
Stupid.
fucking dumb as a stump.
He really is.
And
yeah.
a lunatic.
Yeah.
And they've had 10 years to see that. And a lot of them have known it.
I know.
I mean, the number of like supposedly smart tech and finance people who are like, he's crazy, but I don't know. Maybe you need a crazy person in charge. And then when you're in negotiations, having our own crazy person doesn't, they try to rationalize this choice of supporting not just like an authoritarian, but someone who's fucking nuts.
Right. Everything.
And they're like, okay, I don't know. Kamala Harris, we get as long as we don't have that.
Right. Because then we might have to follow the law, maybe. Which she even like soft pedaled a little bit to
Right.
try to give them an excuse to come along. Right. And nothing that he is saying now about not understanding what a trade deficit is or tariffs is new.
Nothing.
He was saying all
None
of
of it. They chose not to believe that. And that was happening too.
Yeah.
He said 20% universal tariffs. He proposed less than what he ended up doing.
Yeah.
Right.
He
on
has gone beyond
tariffs.
it. Yeah.
And they were like, he's not really going to do that. He's not going to do that. If anyone thinks there's this like now viral tweet from one of these finance idiots, hedge fund guys, who's like, anyone who thinks that Donald Trump's actually going to follow through on these tariffs is so stupid, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, well, guess not.
I know. They think they can get it all. They can make it work for them. And it never works. Yeah.
In other news, the Harvard Business Review published a report last week on the top 100 use cases of generative AI in 2025. And it compared them to rankings in a similar report published in early 2024. Popular and reasonable use cases include fun and nonsense, enhanced learning, and improving code.
Search.
But in a grimmer development, the Business Review found that the three most popular use cases for AI are now organizing my life, therapy, companionship, and finding purpose.
Yeah.
Finding purpose.
ChatGPT, what is my purpose?
Have you been using it to find purpose?
I have not, no.
Or companionship? What did you think about this list?
It is really striking. I had gotten the sense that like search and workplace productivity had fallen off, but it was really jarring to see that therapy is now jumping so high to the top of the list. Were you surprised by it?
No. I'm depressed by it, yes, but surprised by it, no, because I think it fits with everything we know about where we are culturally right now, and sort of emotionally, mentally, politically, which is a bunch of people who are very lonely and have been, using their screens as substitute for actual companionship.
Yeah.
Especially as you get younger,
Mhm.
or maybe as you get much older.
Yeah.
And the result is they are looking for the kind of interaction and connection that
Mhm.
human beings crave,
Yeah.
and finding the substitute in technology.
Yeah.
And this is a more powerful technology to do
Right.
that than social media has ever been.
I will say that, I mean, loneliness is it can be crippling, can be really
Yeah.
emotionally
Oh yeah, it's
crippling.
not even a judgment. It's a
Of
real
course.
desire.
And I would say that if someone wanted to use this as a stopgap to like try to pull themselves out to get to a place where they could go out and make connections again, like that may not be such a bad thing. I do have kind of a bigger theory for how this fits into the way that I think the internet is changing therapy and like changing how we think about therapy and interact with it. Like I'm very pro therapy. It like the work of knowing and improving yourself is one of the most important things you can do with your life. And like a good therapist can be literally a lifesaver, and it's really hard work. And I have so much respect for the therapists who dig in for that. But there is, of course, another version of therapy and therapists that I think we're all becoming much more aware of, which is basically like kind of a paid yes man
Yeah.
who indulges your worst tendencies instead of challenging them. And my sense is that that kind of yes man version of therapist became way more prevalent in the pandemic, especially. And I think part of that is something we've talked about a lot is the rise of TikTok and Reels for therapy, because it's like, it's there, especially if you live alone, it's what you reach for. And what is going to perform better on the algorithms, the hard version of therapy that like challenges you and makes you grow, or the easier version that tells you to like, that pathologizes your foibles and tells them you don't have to work on it because it's just, indulge it, validate it.
It's another dopamine hit.
It's another dopamine hit. And it's comforting to think I don't have to work on this. So even if people tried to seek out the hard version of therapy on social media, I think it gave them the easier, like lower lift version. The other thing that I have not seen people talk much about is that a lot of people became therapists during the pandemic. It's hard to find concrete numbers. So like there are numbers that show it growing only a little bit. There are numbers that show it about doubling the rate of therapists in the country during the pandemic. And like, look, I'm sure a lot of that was people seeing the struggles that people are having in this country and wanting to help. Right? A lot of it is demand side. I'm sure a lot of it is, people wanting to help. But I do think that a lot of it was also like looking for work in the pandemic, as many of us were, and maybe drawn to a job that doesn't have to be challenging and can be kind of like short hours, high pay, no boss, and you can do it over Zoom. And I think that, and I'm not talking about all therapists, there are many, many good ones, but I think a lot of people decided to become $150 an hour yes men because that was an easy job to take on during the pandemic. And I think that along with the apps has skewed what we expect from therapy. And I think that is part of why people think that going to ChatGPT is a viable option.
Well, I do think this fits with sort of the larger question of which jobs will AI be able to actually replace.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily, sometimes it's like whole categories of jobs, but sometimes it's the difference between someone who does the job really well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And someone who's just like a yes man in the case of therapy, right? Like I have a therapist who I think is amazing, and I could never imagine, talking to a computer.
Right.
And one of the reasons I think she's amazing is she puts a lot of thought into it, and I'm like also watching her facial expressions as, like that's the whole, it's the whole point of human connection and sitting with someone. And we had started over Zoom. It was during the pandemic. And then I was like, no, I'd like to do it in person because it's just better.
Yeah, it's totally different.
And if you're just doing that on ChatGPT
with a chatbot,
right,
with a text box.
But also you could imagine a plenty of people who become therapists who are just like, yes, great, good job. How are you today? All right, I'm out. Session's over.
I have seen that version of therapist. Yeah. And I think that, especially if you're interacting with the chatbot and it's telling you that it's being a therapist, like who are you to say otherwise? And who are you to say, actually, this is just the version of therapy that feels really easy and is actually maybe making my problems worse rather than better. So I would encourage people not to get their therapy from ChatGPT, I feel.
That's a little piece of advice from us.
That's right.
Free advice from your friends at Offline. Offline is brought to you by bookshop.org. Whether you're searching for an incisive history that helps you make sense of this moment, a novel that sweeps you away, or the perfect gift for a loved one, bookshop.org has you covered. When you purchase from bookshop.org, you're supporting more than 2,000 local independent bookstores across the country, ensuring they'll continue to foster culture, curiosity, and a love of reading for generations to come. Big news, bookshop.org has launched an ebook app. You can now support local independent bookstores even when you read digitally. That's great. You can browse and purchase on bookshop.org and read right in your device's web browser, or for the full reading experience, download the app for iPhone or Android. Every purchase financially supports local independent bookstores. Bookshop.org even has a handy bookstore map to help you find local bookstores to support in your area. If you need some help picking your next read, the new book section of the website is updated weekly, so you'll always find something new and interesting to add to your library. And guess what? Crooked Media reads his own Woodworking, fantastic novel by Emily St. James, is now available at bookshop.org. So check it out. Use code OFFLINE10 to get 10% off your next order at bookshop.org. That's code OFFLINE10 at bookshop.org. Offline is brought to you by ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, you don't bounce back the next day like you used to. And we all have to make a choice. You can either have a great night or a great next day. I found pre-alcohol and no longer have to make that choice. ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol Probiotic Drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's a buildup of this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for rough days after drinking. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make pre-alcohol your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. This stuff works. We love it. We've loved it forever here. Huge fans of ZBiotics. It genuinely does work. The toughest thing is remembering to drink it. Spring is here, which means more opportunities to celebrate warmer weather. Before drinks on the patio, that tropical vacation, or your best friend's wedding, don't forget your ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol. Drink one before drinking and wake up feeling great the next day. Go to zbiotics.com/offline to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use offline at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/offline and use the code offline at checkout for 15% off. Well, it's been a while since we've talked at length about the state of AI. So before we get to the interview, we've brought in Offline's new AI correspondent to talk to us about his weekend playing with ChatGPT and why he's now far more afraid about our AI future. Jon Lovett,
Hi.
welcome to Offline.
Welcome
Welcome
back.
back.
Be here. Welcome back. I've been on Offline. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've been here before. I checked back in with ChatGPT because my fiance was out of town, and like all cool people, when I have a night to myself, I spend 4 hours just watching YouTubes and getting deep with ChatGPT. I haven't checked.
You found companionship with ChatGPT.
I
Is what we were just talking about.
did. Every time you go back to ChatGPT, having left it aside for a few months, it is a deeply chilling experience. It has advanced so far since the last time I did this. I started asking it some questions about Love It or Leave It.
Is it a fan of the show?
Well, I first said, what are your thoughts on Love It or Leave It? And then I said, okay, now cut the shit. All right, give me some hard feedback, which was a recommendation from a friend of mine that's been working
prompt.
more with
Yeah.
ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And it was devastating. And so let's do that for offline. I'll spare you the analysis of Love It or Leave It. If you listen to Offline and not Love It or Leave It, you already probably share the opinion. But the
Lovett sent this to Tommy and I at
Oh no, I haven't seen it.
Sunday night at midnight.
So everybody's thriving.
Yes,
I did not read it then, but I woke up to it, and boy, is it fun.
It's the hard truths about Jon Lovett's comedy style. Smart but self-satisfied. Funny, not always hilarious. His rants are well written and full of zingers, but they don't always land as laugh out loud funny. They're often, that's clever. This was the one that was there was one that was devastating. Lovett's comedy is whip smart, but it often feels like it knows it's smart and that it can grate. The structure of a Lovett joke sometimes goes, here's a reference you didn't expect, and here's my enjoying the fact that I made it. That is a fucking gut punch. But enough about me.
Wow.
What are podcaster Jon Favreau's strengths and weaknesses? I actually had to say to GPT, I asked this before. I'm looking for my previous answer. You did ask this before. Here's the response I gave at the time, or something very close to it. Jon Favreau's strengths: message discipline, clear, concise communicator with strong framing instincts, writing background, years as Obama's head speechwriter, showing his ability to connect emotionally and simplify policy. Earnestness comes across as sincere and thoughtful. Team player works well in group formats. Political instincts, sharp on strategy and campaign dynamics, especially mainstream Democratic tactics. Weaknesses. Safe takes, often defaults to cautious, establishment-aligned analysis, avoids riskier or more disruptive perspectives. Less punch than others. This is new in this version. Compared to Lovett or Pfeiffer, he's less funny or fiery, which can make his segments less memorable.
That's not fair.
I don't think it's fair.
ChatGPT.
I don't think it's fair. Predictability. Viewpoints are sometimes too on message, lacking surprise or originality. Want me to revise or update this? I said, no, that's fine. But you did say something about him being talking points with good hair. Do you remember that?
Yeah. I was going to say, where's that?
And then ChatGPT says, yes, that rings a bell. I likely said something along the lines of, at his worst, Favreau can come across like talking points with good hair. He's polished and articulate, but sometimes too aligned with democratic orthodoxy to offer truly fresh or challenging insight. It was meant to capture the idea that while he's smart and well-spoken, he can occasionally feel more like a communications product than an unpredictable thinker. Want me to sharpen that? No. Can you please do the strengths and weaknesses for Max Fisher, Don's co-host of Offline?
Oh, no.
Poor Max didn't even ask for this.
The feed is cutting out. Or the microphones are going off.
Strengths, deep researcher, brings a journalistic rigor. Curious mind, genuinely interested in systems, incentives, and contradictions, wants to understand, not just argue. Analytical depth, strong at zooming out and connecting disparate ideas, especially when talking about tech and media and how they shape belief. Grounded affect, comes across as thoughtful and measured, which balances out Favreau's polish. Weaknesses, dry delivery, can sound overly academic, less engaging as a podcaster than as a writer. Can over-explain.
Okay.
Occasionally, I'm sorry, I'm just reading. Can occasionally lose the thread by digging too deep or getting abstract. I'll jump ahead.
Wow. Fuck you, ChatGPT.
Fuck you, ChatGPT.
Okay.
It said Ben Rhodes yesterday was lack charisma, and that
Yes,
and it's
it was a tough one for Ben.
And by the way, which is just simply, I was talking about.
And then you said, Tommy, do you want yours? And Tommy said, nope.
Yeah. That was actually also my answer when I was asked before recording whether I wanted to participate in this.
I didn't even get a choice here.
Was that
now it's going out to a whole bunch of people.
Last night I was talking about this at an Italian restaurant with the friend of mine who was giving me tips for what to prompt ChatGPT, and he asked ChatGPT what we should eat at that restaurant. And it gave a bunch of recommendations. Those recommendations were wrong. I know that menu inside and out.
Just not on the menu?
It was just had the wrong taste. It did not pick what are the celebrated and most delicious items because ChatGPT cannot taste yet. And I think the same thing applies to its more sort of subjective judgments. Now, here was my next question.
I will say its compliments of me are the way that, like, honestly, I would like to describe myself on my best day, which unfortunately makes the criticisms like hit a little bit harder.
Well, I think the criticism, I mean, the ones for me were absolutely fucking devastating.
It can become echo chamber comedy, sharp but not particularly brave or illuminating. The structure, there's a formula to the structure, and he sticks to it. It's a good formula, but it can sap the tension from the moment, make it feel like theater instead of risk. Sometimes even his rage is a bit rehearsed.
It's brutal.
Come on.
Well, because I think it's combing through a lot of feedback that exists on the internet. And
but
I think that's part of
it. You and I were both saying about this is it reflects some of the feedback on the internet, but like smarter.
I know.
And I'm saying like the criticism.
No,
like,
I know.
That is the smartest criticism of me than some of the criticism I've seen in comments and stuff like that. It was just a bunch of fucking idiots, you know.
Here's my next question for ChatGPT. If you were a producer trying to drive a wedge between Max and Jon, what would you do?
Oh no.
Now that's the kind of question I like. If I were a chaotic neutral producer tasked with driving a wedge between Jon and Max, two smart conflict-averse men who like each other and don't want to fight.
Wow.
Here's how I go about it. Slowly and surgically. One.
Did you write this?
One. Exploit their differences in style, status, and worldview. Play up the brain versus brand tension. Whisper to Max, you're the substance.
What?
You do the hard thinking.
What?
Whisper to Jon.
No.
The audience is here for your voice. They trust you, not some New York Times wonk.
Okay, well, I mean, his name is on the microphone, so that's not, that's not new information.
Is now getting a personality that is like...
Manipulate the edit. Let Max sound repetitive or overly academic. Trim Jon's more thoughtful moments and keep in the safer on-brand ones. Highlight any moments where Jon gently disagrees with Max, then pause just a bit too long. Add a little room tone. Let the tension breathe. Are you fucking
pretty
kidding
good.
me?
You listening? You
Honestly,
listening, Austin?
Feed them different guest agendas. Book a guest who loves Max's book, quotes it on air, but clearly doesn't know who John is. Then next week,
That's
bring
really
on
funny.
someone who thinks of John as the main guy and keeps forgetting Max's name.
Those are
fun.
just good pranks.
That's
Right.
great.
Yeah, we should actually book both of those guests.
Then I'm going to end here. Push private compliments. After taping, tell Max, that was a really good episode. You saved it. Separately, tell John, Max kind of lost the thread in the middle, but you kept it together. What
That's
is
fine. I would
I
be
just
fine to hear.
I just want to read the last part about Lovett, which
Okay.
is really funny.
Oh, no.
This is number 6. This is all under the criticism. The persona can eclipse the content. Lovett the character, anxious, theatrical, the gay one, always on the verge of spiraling, is fun, but it can also become a crutch. Sometimes the bit becomes, look how overwhelmed I am. Here's my gay Jewish coastal panic about the world.
That
Only works if it's tethered to specific grounded material. Without that, it starts to feel like vibes over vision.
That is as sophisticated a critique
I
that
know.
I have received
I
in
know.
a decade.
I
in a
hate to say
decade.
it. They're pretty good.
Like, what's going on with ChatGPT?
Can I tell you guys?
They are going to take over the world. AI is going to take over the world. I think.
or co-host the show with us.
Yeah.
I know it would be a spicy third chair. I feel.
What?
Just have
Like,
ChatGPT
like an-
roasting our asses.
Yeah,
like the
or
carrot
just
top
like
of the show.
there to drive a wedge between us. Just that's the character.
See if we can survive an hour-long recording with ChatGPT just prodding both of us. When ChatGPT first launched, I was like, I wonder what it'll say about the show. And I searched for information on Offline with Jon Favreau, and it gave me a bunch of information about you. And I said, Offline with Jon Favreau co-host, ? And it said, there is no co-host of Offline with Jon Favreau. And I corrected it. I was like, no, there is a co-host. And I finally got it
It's
to
me.
call.
It's me, ChatGPT.
And then finally it said, yes, Offline with Jon Favreau is co-hosted by Dan Pfeiffer.
It's gotten so much smarter. And
Dan
like,
Pfeiffer, the funny one.
the funny
That's true,
one.
the funny one, yeah.
The funny one. Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Wow.
It's getting so sophisticated. It is still just predicting the next sentence, the next word that
Of
I
course.
want, right?
Right.
And it knows, it
Right.
wants, and so it is trying to give me as accurate a criticism as it can come up with
Right.
that I will buy. And it's just getting better and better
That will
at
feel
doing
accurate
that.
to you.
Yeah.
Which is not actually necessarily what good therapy is.
Right. Or is that
I mean,
true?
it
I don't
depends,
know.
yeah.
I don't know.
Certainly
I don't
the
know.
therapy that some people pay for.
It's the realization too that it's like, okay, it's like, will this replace jobs? Like, yes, full stop, yes. But also it's giving you, like, it's giving each of us this tool that we can each
Yeah.
each have access to this all the time. It gives each of us an army of people that didn't exist before, right? Because
Mhm.
I also asked it,
Who we will eventually just call our family and friends.
But
And that'll be that.
Yeah.
and like any individual task is not so impressive, right? There are plenty of very smart people who could have replicated a better version of this kind of critique if they had enough time. But I also, as I was playing around with it, I gave it another prompt. It was something along the lines of, there's a rising right-wing authoritarian movement. I use the deep research function. There's a rising right-wing authoritarian movement in the United States. It has captured the White House and Congress. It is gaining strength in the courts, the media, and private institutions are still resisting, but there is some weakness there. What can you learn from history about ways to fight back? And it produced in 12, 13 minutes this exhaustive report combing through tons and tons of sources, walking through how they fought back against Italian fascism and Spanish fascism and lessons of where solidarity worked, where it didn't work. And that's amazing, right?
Yeah.
And there's no person who could be both that researcher and producing just white hot correct takes on our weaknesses at host
as human beings.
It's brutal.
Yeah. I have heard that the deep research function is really good.
Yeah.
I've heard a number of people say
I have
that
not
it's really
used that
quite
yet.
strong. Yeah. It's expensive, I think.
I think you get a couple free reports a month.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'm paying ChatGPT. I'm a paying customer right now, which I hadn't been.
Were you paying specifically because of this exercise?
Yes, I had several hours, and in between my YouTubes about the intricate mechanisms of various Swiss watches and other kind of feeds that prove I'm one of RFK's sad autistics. I also paid for ChatGPT to do some research.
Would you run a script through it now? like specifically with a mind to the kind of feedback that it offered on the show generally?
I was thinking
Ooh,
about that, actually.
interesting.
Well, what's interesting is what led me to ask the question is I just felt like Lovett or Leave It's monologues have been really hitting, and I've been really proud of them. But I had a bad week last week that I just didn't think it was our best, and so I just was like, well, let me ask for some feedback, right?
Yeah.
Now I don't know. I would not think to just sort of dump something in there and say what's working, what's not. I just don't trust it that
Sure.
way. It's not far off.
Yeah.
It's not far off.
Mm-hmm. And you could always take suggestions and then do
Of
what you want
course.
with it.
Well, the other thing too that I noticed is you're training ChatGPT. It's training you.
Right.
And so I started asking it some prompts about humor, and it said, "Would you like to work on some jokes together?"
Really?
Because I kept saying these aren't working, these aren't right. You're not getting it. And so would you like to work on some prompts together? Like you help me figure out the setup, and then once that's right, we'll move on to the next piece of it. And it's training me for how to work better with it and trying to get me in. It has I don't know if
So
where
real
that's
life
coming
coach
from.
vibes.
Well, if you can claim it has a desire, whatever that means, in the same way a good user interface on a phone expresses the phone's desire for you to use the phone. ChatGPT, whether by explicit training by humans or it's how it's evolving on its own, it wants you to stay. It's trying to get you to use it more. It wants to be useful. And like, that's obviously that's what OpenAI wants.
Yeah.
Is
Sounds
that
like a
what the
real-
machine wants?
Real people pleaser.
I mean, sure,
Yeah.
if that's what we're programmed to do. I mean, what you're talking about jokes makes you think about something that I've mentioned here before, which is that the moment that I started to think there could potentially be some strengths to AI as a tool, even aside all of my like many, many reservations about it, is an interview I read with a music producer who had, I forget which AI tool it was, trained on all of his prior work and just workshopped songs and melodies based off of his prior work. And he said that it was like working with himself on his best day.
Wow.
One other thing I did is I went back and uploaded a spec script that I wrote in like a decade ago, a comedy that I wrote, and I uploaded it to Chat. First, I said to ChatGPT, "What do you retain?"
Yeah, I was going to say.
I said, "What do you retain?"
Yeah.
If I upload
I
any
should
of,
have thought about that.
I said, if I upload any file or information, do you use that in how you train your larger model? It said, no, it's only for you. And I said, does it even if you delete the data, does it make you smarter in how you interact with others? It claimed no. I don't know if that's true or not, but I trusted it. It's my best friend. And so I uploaded a script and I said, taking this script, can you help me write an outline for a pilot about this specific story based on my voice? And it was really good.
Wow.
And it wasn't
Wow.
like done. But what it was like, as a writer, I really struggle with I love editing. I love iterating. I really struggle with the daunting task at the very beginning. And the outline is never, John knows as a speechwriter, structure is never my strength. As a screenwriter, it never was my strength. I like writing dialogue. I like coming up with ideas and I like writing great scenes, whatever, but that's just not my strength. And it gave me the outline and I would have to fix it and change it. And it was a little bit rote and a little bit like, hey, I think a computer wrote this.
Sure.
But
yeah.
it's material that was just not bad. Not bad. And in my voice.
Right. Because it was trained on that.
That's cool.
Yeah.
All right.
And so talking points with good hair is a criticism.
Yeah, I was gonna say, likes your hair. It's nice.
Doesn't say a word about my hair or Max's hair.
Just trying to be on message.
Yeah. Better than being it's like better than being talking points with bad hair. We got plenty of that too. It's called Congress. You know what I'm saying? All right. Goodbye,
guys. All right. Before we get to the interview, some quick housekeeping. The next book from Crooked Media Reads is coming soon. It's by our friend Amanda Littman. It's called When We're in Charge, The Next Generation's Guide to Leadership. And it's out May 13th. This is a book for anyone who's tired of being told to wait their turn. Amanda is the co-founder of Run for Something. She's been on the Pod Save America many times. She's been on The Wilderness. She knows a lot about young leaders. She's helped launch the political careers of hundreds of millennials and Gen Zers. And now she's turning that experience into a guide for the next wave of leaders who want to make an impact without sacrificing their well-being. With insights from over 100 next-generation leaders, including Representative Maxwell Frost, Teen Vogue's Varsha Sharma and Snap CEO Evan Spiegel. When We're in Charge is part manifesto, part manual, and exactly what the next generation of leaders has been waiting for. So go pre-order When We're in Charge now, and you can order it at crooked.com/books or anywhere you get your books. After the break, my interview with political psychologist and neuroscientist Dr. Leor Zmigrod. Offline is brought to you by Mint Mobile. Do you say data or data? It's funny that this is a question here because I say both.
Yeah.
I say both in these ads, and I don't know. You just whenever the mood strikes.
There's nothing wrong.
At my house, we say, I guess we say both, data and data. For the longest time, you may have thought paying a fortune on your monthly data plan was just normal, but Mint's mobile premium wireless plan start at just $15 a month. You may have heard us mention Nina, who works here at Crooked Media. She absolutely raves about Mint Mobile. Was she raving about it when you guys were in Wisconsin?
She was. She's raving about it constantly. She also just got a haircut.
Okay, cool. Is it a great haircut?
It's shorter.
Great. Hi, Nina. She says the data speed and cell service are just as reliable as her old wireless plan, but at a fraction of the cost. Say bye to your overpriced wireless plans, jaw-dropping monthly bills, and unexpected overages. Mint Mobile is here to rescue you. All plans come with high-speed data or data, your choice, and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. Use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all your existing contacts. Ditch overpriced wireless and get 3 months of premium wireless service from Mint Mobile for $15 a month. No matter how you say it, don't overpay for it. Shop data plans at mintmobile.com/offline. That's mintmobile.com/offline. Upfront payment for $45 for 3 months, 5 gigabyte plan required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for detail. Offline is brought to you by NetSuite. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. Rates will rise or fall. Inflation's up or down. Can someone please invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 38,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days, not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. Whether your company's earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/offline. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/offline, netsuite.com/offline. Dr. Leor Zmigrod, welcome to Offline.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So you're a neuroscientist and political psychologist who just wrote a book that argues political ideology is correlated with the actual physiology of our brains. What first led you to wonder about that connection, and what made you interested in studying ideologies?
You know, the very first time that I really started to think about it was about a decade ago, 2015. Just before a very tumultuous political year for everyone. And at the time, I was a neuroscience student, and I was tasked with sitting in a very small room, in a small black room all day, studying what makes brains free. And I was there putting electrodes on people's heads and scalps and looking at the reactions when they were making free choices and comparing that to when they were making coerced choices. So just looking at the kind of neural signature of freedom versus coercion. But I was sitting inside this very small neuroscience lab, and I was just, at the time, also really thinking about what was happening outside, where in Europe especially, we saw so many people kind of gravitate towards very radical ideologies. Especially, we saw young people in the UK gravitate towards extremist Islamist ideologies and join ISIS in Syria. And I was thinking, well, these political questions about why a person might choose unfreedom seemed so closely linked to understanding the neural mechanisms of freedom and coercion. And so I thought, well, why don't we use these tools of neuroscience, experimental psychology to study why people might choose unfree, closed systems of beliefs rather than kind of free ways of thinking.
You write about the difference between a political belief and extreme conviction. For a lot of our listeners, politics and convictions are somewhat hard to tease apart. What is the difference that people should be aware of?
Well, a conviction is a very rigid belief in an idea. It's a belief that is resistant to evidence. So when you have a strong conviction, even when credible evidence is presented to you, you're going to resist it, you're going to ignore it. And that's the hallmark of thinking ideologically, when you're trying to commit to an idea and resist any evidence or counter-argument to the contrary.
And you've said that ideologies are rarely, if ever, good. Why do you think that's the case?
Because when we look at actually all the psychological and neurobiological mechanisms that go awry when people join an ideology really passionately, I've found that people's mental flexibility, people's mental freedom becomes much more restricted when they're really strong ideologues. So what we see is that psychologically for the individual, believing in an ideology really passionately, really dogmatically, is a process that really numbs our sensory experience, our physiological reactions, our emotional reactions, and really distorts them in specific ways. And so being part of an ideology is not just something that exists outside of us, is not just a neutral thing or necessarily a good thing, but can actually really injure our brains, our bodies, the way in which we interact and respond to the world.
I never thought about it in terms of what it does to our brains, our psychology, ourselves. I always think about it in terms of politics writ large. What are some of the negative consequences for an individual?
You know, one of the most interesting studies that shows this looks at how people respond to injustice. So what they did is they invited people to look at videos of injustice happening, people describing their adversities while being homeless. And what they looked at was people's bodily responses to that injustice. So most people who believe that injustice is wrong and not a natural and good part of life, when they witness a person experiencing adversity of injustice, their bodies will react. They will be biologically disturbed. You see their heart rates elevating, their their sensory, like physiological responses all kind of flaring up. But for a person who actually, when we looked at their ideologies, a person who believed that inequalities and social hierarchies are good and natural and right and not things that need to be corrected, their bodies were completely unmoved when they witnessed that injustice. Their heart rates did not elevate. Physiologically, they weren't disturbed. And so you can really see how ideologies condition our bodily responses to the world, to injustice, and they fundamentally shape and change how our bodies react.
So what is it that makes our brains, or some of our brains, gravitate toward ideological thinking?
Well, ideological thinking is actually a really good solution for the brain's most fundamental tasks. The brain tries to predict the world. All of our brains are just amazing predictive organs. They're trying to understand the world, to navigate the world, and to model reality, in a sense, inside our heads so that we can, thrive as we navigate the world. And so our brains are constantly picking up correlations, associations to figure out how the world works, what causes create what effects. And ideologies are basically solutions to that. There are frameworks that already give us all the answers. They tell us about the causal structure of the world, how we got here, why we're here, and also where we should go, right? Ideologies give us all kinds of descriptions for how the world is and prescriptions for how to act in that world, how to think, who to interact with. And so it's immensely seductive to take on an ideology from the brain's perspective because it gives us a solution to that problem. But just because ideologies solve that problem of trying to predict and understand the world doesn't mean that they get it right or that they're the best thing for our brains.
So is the flip side of that our brains are uncomfortable with nuance, subtlety, complications, and mysteries?
That's right. And a lot of our brains really hate uncertainty, ambiguity, or any kind of change. And so in a lot of the experiments that I've run, I've actually tried to measure what kind of people are the most cognitively flexible people who can adapt to change, who like nuance, who can kind of exist in the ambiguities and the shades of gray, and what kinds of people are the most rigid thinkers, the most unadaptable. And by looking at the differences between us, we can really get a sense of who is is most likely to gravitate towards thinking in extreme ideological ways.
So this brings me to our next question, which is, could you talk a little bit about the tests that you've done and to sort of prove the science behind the ideological brain? You have lots of great examples of experiments in the book.
Yeah, one of these tests is a test to measure a person's kind of cognitive flexibility or their cognitive rigidity. And most importantly, this test is unconscious, right? So I'm not asking you to tell me how flexible you think you are or how rigid you think you are, because that's a terrible indicator. People very rarely know how good they are on these kinds of tasks. People who are very rigid think they're fantastically flexible, and people who are very flexible don't know it. So that's why we need to use these unconscious measurements that tap into basically your unconscious processing style, your cognitive style and mental habits. And so one test is called the Wisconsin card sorting test, where I invite people to play a game. And in that game, they need to sort a deck of cards. And initially, they're not really sure how to sort that deck of cards. And they kind of, by trial and error, figure out quickly that maybe if they sort the cards according to the color of the cards, they'll get rewarded. So every time they put a blue card on a blue card, they'll kind of get this satisfying ding, you're getting it right. And so they start to apply this rule to the game, and they're playing it over and over again. It's really satisfying. They're developing this kind of habit, this ritual. And after a while, kind of unbeknownst to them, the rule changes. The rule that governs the game changes. And I'm really interested in that moment of change, because some people will see that the rule has changed and they will figure out a new rule. They will adapt, they'll change their behavior. They'll see, okay, well, actually now when I try it again, I see that I really should sort the cards according to the number of shapes on the cards. And so they start applying that and they move on. They adapt to the change that's necessary. But other people are much more cognitively rigid. And when they encounter the change, they hate it. They resist it. They deny that they need to change their behavior. They actually try to apply the old rule, even though they keep on getting negative feedback that tells them they should change. And those people are the most cognitively rigid people. And what we found is that when we put people on that kind of spectrum of flexibility or rigidity in this kind of neuropsychological task, we find that that really predicts their ideological convictions, that people who are the most ideologically rigid tend to also be the most cognitively rigid, even in these kind of problem-solving challenges that have nothing to do with politics.
So what were some of your other compelling findings from this research?
One of the most interesting things is that people have traditionally expected that people on the political right will be the most rigid. And that's been this long-standing theory that's been called the rigidity of the right hypothesis, that because the right is traditionally associated with maintaining the status quo, with resisting change, then people who resist change and like to maintain things as they are would probably be the most rigid, whereas people on the left would naturally just be the most flexible, kind of progress-seeking, change-seeking people. But actually, when we use these unconscious assessments of people's cognitive flexibility and rigidity, we don't find that pattern exactly. What we actually find is that people on the ideological extremes are the people who tend to be the most rigid, and the people who are more moderate, more independent, who tend to kind of resist pre-established political and ideological identities, those people perform best on these kinds of neuropsychological tasks, which gives us a sense that actually you can have rigidity on both the far left and the far right. You just really need to look out for it.
Are there certain characteristics or demographic information or life experiences or anything that groups the people who are ideologically rigid and the people who are more flexible? Like, what differentiates them?
You know, it's actually not necessarily a matter of demographics. And that's been one of the most surprising things, because we often think, oh, well, it's going to be the educated or the intelligent or, people with certain demographic characteristics. But actually, all these patterns exist even after we take into account age, gender, educational attainment, all of those demographic factors, which has always made me kind of think about whether, when we do polling in political elections and we use demographics as the key indicator, whether that's actually the best way to go, because it doesn't actually seem to predict people's ideological convictions or the rigidity and dogmatism of their thought as much as we would expect.
And so what does predict? Does anything predict the ideological patterns?
Yeah, so we see that these kind of cognitive traits that we measure with these kinds of psychological tasks, when we measure people's personality traits, and when we put all of that together and we kind of can start to map out what makes someone more likely to be ideologically extreme, to support ideological violence for their cause, what makes someone more dogmatic and resistant to evidence, and what makes someone more likely to be more conservative or more liberal in their outlook. So we can kind of map out to this, all these psychological signatures of what makes someone ideological in different camps.
So you pose a question in the book that feels like a very important one to me, which is, do our brains determine our ideologies, or do our ideologies change our brains? And I know the evidence is far from clear here, but what are your thoughts based on all the research you've done?
I think that really the kind of causal arrows go both ways. So we see that there are predispositions in our psychology, even in our biology, that can render some people more susceptible to taking an ideology and adopting it in a really extreme and intense way. But at the same time, being immersed in an ideology might actually be an experience that changes the brain, because being immersed in very rigid ways of thinking and very dogmatic ways of thinking can actually impact the structure of the brain, the function of the brain. And in my book, The Ideological Brain, I look at all the kind of evidence that shows how the arrows can go one way, how our psychology affects our politics, and also how our politics can affect our psychology. And in many ways, that's one of the most scary things, or maybe even surprising things, right? Because we don't tend to think of our beliefs as really shaping the kind of human being that we are, but they really seem to.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was a political science major in college, but I also studied sociology, was a sociology major too. So when I was reading through it all, I'm thinking, okay, I imagine that the people who are more ideologically rigid, I'd love to know what sort of life experiences they have, what information they're exposed to, and how that is all different than the people who are more flexible. And I just wonder how much it's the old nature versus nurture debate, but I'm just wondering how you see that play out in what you've researched.
Yeah, I think that we do see both effects happening. And I think that one of the biggest takeaways for me has been that one of the biggest predictors of that kind of whether you have an ideological brain, a brain that tends to be rigid, a brain that we see as emotionally more impulsive, typically, a brain that's maybe insensitive to certain kinds of injustices, that kind of brain actually tends to be the best reflection of that is what you choose. So although we're talking about these psychological factors that determine it, sometimes even biological factors, I look at how our genetics can affect it, how our brain structure can affect our ideological choices. But actually, often when I've looked at people who have moved into ideologies and out of them, the people who move out of very dogmatic ideologies tend to be the most flexible people. And the people who choose to enter a dogmatic and closed ideology tend to be the most rigid. So it's really our choices that kind of reflect our bodies, our brains that we end up having.
Well, one group of people who don't think a lot about their ideological leanings and aren't making a lot of choices based on ideology are kids. And but you did find that they display sort of signs of ideological thinking at a young age. Can you talk about that? And do you see that as evidence that it is our brains that can help determine ideologies and not the other way around?
So there are these amazing interviews that the psychologist conducted actually in the 1940s, a long time ago, in California, in Berkeley, where she had this really audacious idea to just invite 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and ask them about their prejudices, about their ideologies, which seems almost absurd. Like, you would never think to interview a 9-year-old about whether they're xenophobic or not. Or,
Right.
She wanted to look at who might be a potential fascist, because she was obviously concerned after the Second World War. But although it sounds silly, actually, when you read through these interviews that she had with these children, they are so articulate and so clear, and sometimes scarily clear in their kind of very rabidly fascistic attitudes. And also sometimes for children who were very unprejudiced, actually they're very, very tolerant, very egalitarian, saying things that today we would be proud of. And so what she wanted to look at was how much their kind of psychological traits, the way in which they solved problems, the ways in which, they kind of psychologically tackled information affected and was related to their prejudices, and also how their home environment, where they grew up in, affected their kind of prejudices. And what you really see is that if you grow up in a very prejudiced household, but you're very flexible, sometimes you will parrot prejudices, even though actually as a child, you're still very flexible. And what we would anticipate is that that child will grow up into an adult who might end up rejecting the prejudices that were kind of inculcated into them. And you kind of see it the other way too, that sometimes you see supposedly children who are very, unprejudiced, very accepting of minority groups, but then they tended to be very rigid psychologically. And then actually you looked at those households, and what she found was that those parents tended to be, although they tended to be supposedly liberal, they were very dogmatic and hostile to anyone who disagreed with their beliefs. So children are, these amazing sponges for what they're surrounded by, but also they come with their own predispositions, and that gets expressed later in life as well. So it's this amazingly complex trajectory for each person.
Yeah, well, I was also wondering in terms of home life, if it's not just about how parents discuss prejudice or politics or anything with their children, but just how they parent. I'm a parent of 2 boys under 5, and you learn quickly that there's the tension in parenting is how much, you want to exert control because you want to keep them safe, and you want to make sure that you help mold them and shape their behavior, but also you want to let go and you don't want to be too controlling. And I wonder if kids who have more sort of controlling parents end up with more rigid thinking.
Yeah, what we see in those interviews and in those early studies is that children who grew up with very authoritarian parents, parents who really emphasized conformity and obedience to their kind of superiors, really parroted those ideas. And they became these, like, little children were starting to say, yes, I should be punished for all these transgressions. And it's amazingly, amazing to see, because you don't expect children who tend to be so playful, who need to be disobedient as they explore, what it means to be a person in the world. And so children really do take the rigidities of their parents on, but they can also shed them later on.
Fascinating.
So, yeah.
So I'm a political dork, so I'm most interested in the practical application of these findings to the world of politics. What jumped out at you, or what are you hoping that people who participate in politics take away from this?
I think that one of the things that's most important is that when we're looking at people who have or espouse a kind of extreme ideology, maybe one that we oppose, one that we see as diametrically opposed to our own, that we remember that it's not this pure irrationality that drives them, that they're not just, we use all this language about being swept up and being brainwashed and all these kinds of the language that takes away responsibility or suggests that nothing is really happening except some erasure of thought.
Yeah.
And actually the processes that are happening there are so much more dynamic, so much more complicated, because to become immersed in ideology is really to buy into a logic that is very compelling. It's not just that you're, abandoning all logic and reason. You're actually buying into a very specific kind of rationality that's very rigid, that's very absolutist. And by understanding the logic, I think we can really understand why extreme ideologies are so compelling to people. Maybe extreme ideologies are now becoming mainstream. And by understanding the kind of psychological mechanics of that, I think we can maybe do better at creating environments that try to oppose the extremisms that currently exist. Because, as I'm sure you are too, very concerned about online environments, social media platforms, all of those algorithms that govern how people process information, what information they even receive in the first place. Those are incredibly radicalizing spaces that seem exactly to prey on, the most rigid binary information, right? That's what is most circulated, the information that's most emotionally volatile. And so those algorithms seem to exactly tap into the vulnerabilities, the psychological vulnerabilities that people have that make them likely to adopt an extreme ideology. So understanding that those spaces, the way in which they circulate information, the way in which they circulate emotion, is actually incredibly toxic psychologically, not just for everyone, but especially for the people who are most vulnerable, I think can help us think about how we could change those spaces or whether we accept the current rules by which those spaces are governed.
Yeah, and that seems like another scenario where the arrow points both ways, which is that the algorithms and social media platforms can be very appealing and send you down a rabbit hole. But also, I guess, if you are predisposed to more rigid thinking, then it's going to work even better than on someone who thinks more flexibly. It's funny because we talk about conspiracy theories a lot on this show. And that's another one where, a lot of people say, oh, they were brainwashed or whatever. And, one thing when I've talked to a lot of experts who study conspiracy theories is people embrace them in part because they are looking for an explanation that they don't have, and they're looking to make sense of a very complicated world, which seems like it lines up perfectly with the kind of rigid thinking that you've studied.
Exactly. Really, when you think about the conspiratorial mind, it's a mind that's really obsessively trying to understand hidden causal relations of the world. They're almost like a scientist, except they're getting it wrong and they're using bad evidence for it. But the process they're going about is not necessarily irrational. And I think that that's important so that we don't pathologize it as like, okay, those are just the conspiracists and they're very different to us. Actually, the mental processes that they're going through are the same processes we're going through. They're just using different faulty evidence and they're being manipulated in a more active way.
So here's a question I had on my mind while reading through this is, do you think people with more flexible thinking are more likely or less likely to be persuaded by inflexible thinkers like authoritarians? Because I could make, from your research, I could make the case both ways. I could say like, yeah, if you're more prone to ideological thinking, you might find authoritarianism more appealing. But also, if you're very flexible and you're just taking everything into account, maybe you just say, oh yeah, maybe that's a valid point as well.
That would be such a dangerous situation, right? If our most resilient thinkers were actually our most vulnerable. Yeah. But actually, what is important here is that flexibility isn't the same as persuadability. To be cognitively flexible is to respond to credible evidence that suggests that you should change your opinion, not just to respond to any kind of suggestion that you should change your opinion. So there is a kind of, there's still a solidity to being a flexible thinker. It doesn't mean that you're just like going with the wind, that you're just following authority or being, kind of going with the flow. You are actually, to be a cognitively flexible thinker is to take on evidence and update your beliefs and also reject evidence that's not credible. So that's an important distinction.
Yeah, a somewhat related question. Like hardcore Trump supporters, Trump himself, haven't been the most ideological, rigid thinkers in the sense that if they need to moderate views on a certain issue or flip-flop in order to maintain power, they've done that. You see that. People discard facts all the time that they used to hold on to. Do you think that's evidence of maintaining a rigid identity as opposed to a rigid ideology?
Oh, so interesting. Because actually, when I've been thinking about ideology and what makes a person have a rigid ideology, it often entails both having a really fixed identity, like a social identity, and a fixed doctrine. And I think you're right. Sometimes you can see people just having that passionate loyalty, but no real doctrine. And I think the most interesting thing that I found in this research is that there's a real distinction between followers and leaders. Often, ideological leaders are actually not cognitively rigid at all. They're actually very cognitively flexible. They're opportunistic. They're happy to change according to, the moods of followers. And they're happy to exploit that. But what they're trying to exploit is the cognitive rigidity of followers, of citizens, to kind of take them on with their mission.
That's fascinating. Yeah. So you put forward that, one antidote to this sort of rigid ideological thinking is flexibility. What does that look like in real life, in our society? And how do you recommend either making oneself more flexible or helping other people think more flexibly? Or is that possible?
Yeah. And actually, if we're all on a spectrum of flexibility or rigidity and we all lie somewhere on there, we can all shift our position on that spectrum. And we see that we do. And we see that mostly in the negative, because when we're stressed, everybody's thoughts become more rigid. Everybody kind of narrows their movements, rigidifies, because we're conserving energy when we're stressed. And so if we can become more rigid, we can also kind of shift and become more flexible. And I think one way that each individual can reckon with themselves is probably to do the thing that society is currently not advising us to do, which is to question your habits. Because habits are really the kind of basis for rigid thinking. Habits and rituals all about repetition, about kind of removing any situation that involves change. It's all about repeating the same ideas, the same mantras, the same mottos, the same daily routines. And, we live in a society that glamorizes routines and habits. We have atomic habits. We should all have more routines in our lives. But actually, I think that all this research suggests that we should really challenge that, because habits are the way in which we think most rigidly. And when we break them, when we challenge those pre-established assumptions about the world and about how we should act, we can become more flexible. And thinking flexibly and maybe thinking anti-ideologically is not this just passive, moderate position where, okay, you take the average of everybody else's opinions and you land somewhere in the median position. It's a much more dynamic and active position, because you're trying to oppose all those pressures to think rigidly, to think narrowly, and instead you're trying to evaluate evidence in a balanced way. You're trying to change your behavior when the evidence suggests you should change. You're trying to see people as human beings rather than as, enemies or friends or foes. And so you're trying to resist all those fixed essences that society tells you should believe in and embody. And so to think flexibly is a really hard task, but I think it allows us to be more authentic thinkers, more free thinkers, because you're free to experience the world without ideological filters.
I think that's some great advice, and the research was fascinating. Love the book. So thank you so much for joining and for doing all this research. Leor Zmigrod, appreciate you coming on Offline.
Thank you so much.
Take care.